Her name was Ruth. In 1935, she stood at a cast iron stove in rural Kansas with 43 cents left in the house. The relief truck hadn't come that week. She had a family to feed. She opened the cabinet, cornmeal, salt, a cup of leftover coffee from the morning pot. She made supper from those three things and nobody went to bed hungry. What she made that night doesn't exist in any cookbook you can buy today. The recipe lived in her hands, then it disappeared. Number 25, coffee soup. This one startles people. A thick slice of day-old bread torn into pieces in a bowl, hot black coffee poured over it, a spoonful of sugar if there was any to spare. That was breakfast. That was sometimes lunch. Families in Ohio and Missouri and Pennsylvania made it throughout the 1930s. The coffee cost a few pennies. The bread was already there. Nobody told them to stop making it. The recipe simply became invisible when prosperity returned, and nobody wanted to remember the years when bread soaked in coffee counted as a meal. It has no legal status. It was never regulated. It was just left behind by a country that wanted to forget it had ever happened. Number 24, dandelion green soup. In the spring of 1933, women walked their yards and empty lots with baskets. Free food was growing in the grass. Young dandelion leaves, pulled before the flower opened, simmered with salt pork and water. Bitter, clean, iron-rich. It required no store and no money. The FDA never touched it. What removed it from American tables was the post-war herbicide industry. By the 1950s, suburban lawns were being treated with 2,4-D and related compounds, chemicals whose warning labels would expand considerably in later decades. The dandelion became a problem to eliminate. The soup went with it. Number 23, water pie. Pour water into a pastry shell, add flour, sugar, butter, and vanilla. Bake it. That's the complete recipe. It sounds like a mistake. It isn't. The water and flour bind during baking into something that resembles a soft custard from the center out. One listener wrote in that her grandmother made this every Sunday in 1938 and called it nothing at all. No name, just pie. The recipe never had a label to remove. What ended it was post-war abundance of eggs and milk and cream that made it quietly embarrassing to admit you had ever eaten it in the first place. Number 22, cornmeal mush. 3 ingredients: cornmeal, water, salt. Boiled until thick, poured into a loaf pan, chilled overnight, sliced in the morning, and fried in whatever fat was on hand. A penny meal. Eleanor Roosevelt served it at White House staff breakfasts during the Depression as an act of solidarity. It appeared in every USDA relief pamphlet from 1930 to 1939. Then it disappeared from mainstream print. The post-war food industry had no use for a recipe that required nothing purchased. It survives in a handful of regional southern kitchens, almost nowhere else. Number 21, Sassafras Root Tea. Women boiled the bark of sassafras roots in water and served the resulting red tea each morning. It tasted faintly of root beer. It had been made in American kitchens since before the Republic existed. In 1960, the FDA identified safrole, a compound in sassafras oil, as a potential carcinogen after animal studies. Safrole was banned in food and beverage products that same year. The bark tea, the root beer flavor, the morning cup that had sat on American tables for 2 centuries gone by regulation, not recalled with a notice, not replaced, simply no longer legal to sell in any form. Number 20, poke salad. The young shoots of pokeweed, Phytolacca americana, were boiled twice with the cooking water discarded between each boiling. The double boil removed most of the toxins. What remained was a dark, tender green served with salt pork and vinegar. Families across Appalachia made it through the 1930s without incident when they prepared it correctly. The FDA didn't ban the plant. What ended its place on printed recipe pages was food safety education that rightly noted the same plant is extremely toxic if the preparation goes wrong. 1. Incorrect boiling, no second chance. The recipe requires precision that could never be standardized. It left the printed page quietly and for understandable reasons. Number 19, prune pudding. Eleanor Roosevelt made this. She served it to foreign dignitaries at the White House in 1933. Stewed prunes, sugar, cornstarch, A pinch of salt, cheap, nutritious filling, the press covered it as a humiliation. She was mocked publicly, she served it anyway. The recipe isn't regulated or formally removed. What happened to it was cultural. After the war, abundance made anything that tasted of austerity socially unacceptable. A generation of women who had eaten prune pudding at school lunch programs in 1935 refused to make it for their own children in 1955. The recipe became associated with poverty and stayed buried for 50 years. Number 18. Lard biscuits with drippings gravy. The biscuits were made with pure lard, not shortening, not butter. Lard from the rendered fat of the last hog butchered in the fall, stored in a stone crock in the root cellar through winter. The gravy came from whatever fat had collected in the cast iron pan, flour stirred in, then water or milk if there was any. This recipe appeared on every Depression-era relief pamphlet. By the 1960s, the American Heart Association's campaign against saturated fat had reclassified lard as dangerous. Cookbooks quietly substituted vegetable shortening. The original recipe wasn't recalled, it was simply rewritten until the original became unrecognizable to its own grandchildren. Number 17. Oatmeal with suet. Rolled oats cooked in water, then a small piece of beef sweet stirred in at the end instead of butter. Animal fat meeting grain. It was a working-class breakfast standard throughout the 1930s across the Midwest and the industrial Northeast. The fat kept the hunger away for hours. Nobody regulated it. The post-war shift away from animal fats, the rise of margarine as the modern substitute, and a cultural push toward cleaner-looking breakfast foods ended it without ceremony. By 1955, no women's magazine was printing sweet oatmeal. The recipe vanished from public food culture without any formal notice. Number 16. Mock apple pie. Ritz crackers, sugar, cream of tartar, water, butter, cinnamon, lemon juice. No apples, none at all. The crackers absorbed the syrup and softened into something that reads as apple filling to every sense, including taste. Nabisco printed the recipe on Ritz boxes beginning in 1934. Home economists documented it repeatedly through the 1930s and 1940s. The recipe wasn't banned. Nabisco stopped printing it on the box in the early 1950s when actual apples were once again affordable, and the mock version became something no household wanted to admit it still needed. The recipe still circulates in food history communities. The box no longer carries it. Number 15. Corned beef luncheon salad in gelatin. Canned corned beef, Knox unflavored gelatin, canned peas, vinegar, lemon juice, poured into a mold and chilled, then unmolded onto a plate for company. This was considered an elegant lunch dish in 1937. The gelatin wasn't decorative. It stretched a small can of meat into a dish that fed 6 at a Sunday table. The FDA never touched it. What ended it was post-war prosperity combined with a cultural revulsion towards savory gelatin that set in permanently by the mid-1960s. The recipe still exists in church cookbooks from 1940. Most people under 60 can't be brought to eat it. Number 14. Vinegar pie. A Depression-era substitute for lemon pie in regions where lemons were unavailable or too expensive. Cider vinegar, sugar, eggs, butter, flour. The acid of the vinegar stood in for citrus. The baked filling set into a firm custard. Women in interior farming states made this through the 1930s when the grocery list had to stop at the county line. The recipe has no regulatory history. What removed it from circulation was simple post-war availability of lemons at reasonable prices and the end of any reason to substitute. Nobody regulated vinegar pie. The country moved on and forgot it had ever needed it. Number 13. Hominy made with hardwood lye. Traditional hominy required soaking dried corn in a lye solution to loosen the hull. The lye was made from hardwood ash at home. The process transformed the corn nutritionally, unlocking niacin and improving digestibility. Native American and Southern families had made it this way for centuries before Depression-era kitchens continued the practice. Commercial canned hominy eventually replaced the home process. Food safety guidance now cautions against homemade lye preparations, given the caustic nature of the material and the difficulty of calibrating concentration in a domestic kitchen. The technique wasn't outlawed. The conditions required to practice it safely no longer exist in most homes. Number 12, red dye. Number 2, Maraschino Cherries. The dark red maraschino cherry in your grandmother's fruitcake tin in 1965 wasn't the same cherry sitting in a cocktail today. From the 1920s through 1976, red dye number 2 was the most commonly used food coloring in the country. Maraschino cherries, canned fruit cocktail, artificially colored bakery goods. In 1976, after animal studies linked the dye to possible carcinogenic effects, the FDA revoked its approved status. Every product colored with red dye number 2 was reformulated or discontinued. Your grandmother's fruitcake recipe called specifically for those deep red cherries. The cherries that recipe was written around no longer legally exist. Number 11, homemade root beer with sassafras bark. Before the 1960 ban on saffrole, American families made root beer at home using real sassafras root bark. A pound of bark boiled with water, sugar, and yeast, bottled and left to ferment for 2 days. The recipe appeared in home canning guides throughout the 1930s and 1940s. It tasted different from anything on a shelf today, richer and more bitter at the finish. The 1960 FDA ruling ended legal production of sassafras-flavored beverages. Every commercial root beer was reformulated with artificial flavoring by the mid-1960s. The home recipe became illegal to sell. It largely stopped being made. Number 10, Formaldehyde-Preserved milk pudding. Before widespread refrigeration, small dairies sometimes added trace amounts of formaldehyde to milk to extend shelf life. The practice was common enough that recipes calling for long-shelf milk appear in rural household guides from the 1920s and early 1930s. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 formally prohibited the practice. Rural enforcement was inconsistent. The preserved milk continued in some distribution networks well into the Depression years. Any pudding or custard made with that milk was made with a chemical that has no place at any table. It wasn't a choice any woman made knowingly. She used what the dairy sold her. Number 9, sulfured dried apples and stack cake. Before modern food preservation standardized its methods, dried apples were treated with sulfur dioxide smoke to prevent browning and mold during storage. The fruit was held over a sulfur fire in the smokehouse and then dried in the open air. Depression-era recipes for dried apple stack cake have a specific flavor that modern dried apples can't replicate. The FDA currently limits sulfur dioxide levels in dried fruit. Commercial sulfured fruit, prepared as it was in the 1930s, no longer meets those standards. The stack cake recipe survives in Appalachian community cookbooks. The apples the recipe was originally built around are no longer available. Number 8, Azodicarbonamide sandwich bread. Home bakers didn't use it. Commercial bakeries did. The white sandwich bread purchased at the A&P in 1958 was likely conditioned with azodicarbonamide, a dough additive that improved texture, rise, and shelf life. The same compound is used in the manufacture of foam rubber and yoga mats. The European Union banned it in food use. Several countries followed. The United States still permits it at limited levels, though major chains voluntarily removed it after public pressure in 2014. The bread used to make children's school lunches in 1958 was made with an ingredient now illegal in dozens of countries. The label didn't say so. Number 7, trans fat pie crust from the Depression-era Crisco cookbook. In the 1930s, Procter & Gamble distributed free Crisco cookbooks to home economists and housewives as part of an aggressive marketing campaign to replace animal fat with partially hydrogenated vegetable shortening. Depression-era pie crust recipes in those booklets called for the partially hydrogenated product, trans fats. The FDA declared partially hydrogenated oils no longer generally recognized as safe in 2015. Full compliance was required by 2021. Any Depression-era pie crust recipe that specifies partially hydrogenated shortening now calls for an ingredient that can't legally be manufactured or sold in the United States. The free cookbook is still in some kitchen drawers somewhere. The ingredient listed on page 12 no longer exists. Number 6, Saccharin-Sweetened Preserves. During the Depression and the wartime sugar rationing that followed, saccharin tablets were used in home preserving. Originally developed in 1879 and sold as a pharmaceutical product, Saccharin ended up in Depression-era jam jars and canned fruit because white sugar was simply not available in sufficient quantity. In 1977, the FDA proposed banning saccharin after a Canadian study linked high doses to bladder tumors in rats. Congress placed a moratorium on the ban, but required warning labels. The warning stayed on saccharin products until 2000, when further review led to its removal. The grandmother who made peach preserves with saccharin in 1938 lived to see the ingredient she used move through 3 different regulatory frameworks. She made the same recipe each August. The law changed around her repeatedly. Number 5, diacetyl butter flavoring in Depression-era baked goods. In the 1930s and 1940s, real butter was expensive and sometimes impossible to find. Artificial butter flavoring derived from diacetyl was added to margarine, packaged goods, and baked products to produce the flavor of something richer than what the recipe actually contained. Depression-era recipes calling for artificially flavored margarine were, in effect, calling for diacetyl. By the early 2000s, workers at microwave popcorn factories were developing a severe lung disease called bronchiolitis obliterans, directly linked to inhaled diacetyl vapor. The compound wasn't banned from food use, but most manufacturers voluntarily removed it from consumer-facing products beginning around 2007. The flavor in the recipe survived. The specific compound that originally produced it was quietly replaced without explanation. Number 4, Tartrazine yellow cake. Every yellow birthday cake, every lemon pudding, every yellow candy in an American kitchen from the 1930s through the 1970s was almost certainly colored with FD and C yellow number 5, known as tartrazine. The birthday cake at the table in 1941, the lemon pudding at the church potluck in 1953, the yellow frosting on the sheet cake made for a daughter's graduation. Tartrazine wasn't banned, but in 1979, the FDA required it to be listed by name on all food labels after studies linked it to allergic reactions and hyperactivity concerns in some children. The Depression-era cake recipe didn't specify the dye by name. It just said yellow food coloring. That yellow is no longer anonymous on any ingredient list. Number 3, the grapefruit and egg-reducing plan. This isn't a single recipe, it's a regime. Half a grapefruit and 1 soft-boiled egg at breakfast, black coffee, nothing else until noon. It appeared in medical office pamphlets beginning in the late 1920s and persisted in printed form through the 1950s. Women across every income level followed it. It worked, in the sense that severe caloric restriction produces short-term weight loss. The FDA never regulated it as a food plan. What changed was the medical framing around it. The regime was eventually reclassified not as nutrition guidance, but as a very low-calorie crash protocol capable of producing cardiac events in women with underlying conditions. No doctor hands out that pamphlet anymore. The grapefruit recipe still exists. The institutional authority that made it feel safe and medically sanctioned is what got quietly pulled. Number 2, Aunt Sammy's USDA radio recipes. From 1926 through the 1940s, the United States Department of Agriculture broadcast a radio program featuring a character named Aunt Sammy, the fictional wife of Uncle Sam, designed to reach rural homemakers across America. She read recipes on air. The show ran in 15-minute segments on stretching food, preserving vegetables, and feeding large families on nearly nothing. The USDA published accompanying booklets. Recipes included oxtail soup, salt pork and bean stew, and canned hominy dishes made with government surplus grain. The program ended after World War II when the USDA shifted its public messaging toward post-war abundance and processed food promotion. The booklets went out of print. The government replaced Aunt Sammy with promotional materials for the new packaged food industry. The homemaker who had tuned in every morning was handed a coupon for canned soup instead. Number 1, the Depression-era church supper table. Not one dish, all of them together. The potluck table in the church basement in 1935 held corned beef gelatin mold, lard biscuits, sulfured apple stack cake, sassafras sweet tea, yellow pudding colored with FD and C dyes, and a water pie cooling near the window. Every woman had made something from what she had. Every recipe was built for scarcity. Every ingredient was either later restricted, reformulated, regulated, or simply erased when prosperity made it embarrassing to remember. None of those women received a letter explaining what had changed or why it mattered. They cooked what they knew. They fed their families. The table they set together hasn't existed